Tony Blair's wake-up call. But is he capable of changing the way New Labour ticks? Good evening. Ken Livingstone made history today. Not only did he become London's first directly elected mayor, he's the first person to give Tony Blair a serious and probably chronic headache. Ken's the man of the moment, but what will Mayor Livingstone actually do?
And from outside a Smithfield club where Livingstone supporter Fatboy Slim is appearing, I'll be asking why Ken won the youth vote.
Also tonight, we've been to the key swing territory of Luton to gauge how the issues raised in this election are likely to affect voters in the next general election.
That was the idea when they came in, was to maybe not increase taxes as such, but sort of keep them steady and even reduce them, and that certainly hasn't happened.
And the parties give us their view of whether this is the start of a new kind of politics. London's enjoying its first Friday night with a mayor. We'll digest the implications of all last night's events shortly. But first, Robin Denslow is in Spitalfields to get a feel of how London's taking to the reality of Mayor Ken. Robin.
Well, Ken Livingstone was always the most fashionable candidate, not that he really had very much competition. And he was helped by the likes of Norman Cook, aka Fatboy Slim, who's appearing tonight at a club just behind me. So why has Ken got the youth vote? I'm joined by Ben Turner, who edits an internet music company, and Rachel Newsom, the deputy editor of Dazed and Confused. Ben, is this a glorious new dawn for London as far as you're concerned?
Absolutely. I think Ken genuinely believes that London is the greatest city in the world, and you can see that enthusiasm and that belief all over him. And I think the day that he turned up to see Fatboy Slim DJ at the Astoria, his enthusiasm in the booth and the fact that he really wanted to relate to young people was something that I think everyone can relate to. And as people have voted today, you can see that that's what's happened.
But in real terms, what do you want him to achieve? What will you be looking for?
I think he's just got to obviously try and challenge Tony Blair in some ways. I think it's time that somebody did that, and I think Tony Blair today has said he's prepared to work with Ken. And I think that Ken has done a great job already today in saying that he wants to work with the other contenders who he was working against. So I think he's prepared to listen to everybody here.
Challenge in what sense?
I think there are plenty of problems in London, and I think that it's going to take somebody like Ken who truly knows what London is all about to do something about it.
Rachel, are you out celebrating as well?
I think it's been an interesting day, but I think the whole appeal about Ken Livingstone for young people is his personality that they've been voting for. I think when Labour came in, everyone was really excited. It was a new government. People thought everything was going to change, and Tony Blair's just turned out to be a bit of a paternalistic pariah. And so someone like Ken Livingstone, who has come along, who's a bit radical, a bit of a rebel, a bit of a maverick, he's on the street, he's hanging out with Fatboy Slim. He's speaking a language that young people can relate to. You know, because of pop culture, everybody understands the cult of personality, which Ken Livingstone has managed to construct around himself. But I think the problem with that is that people are probably voting for the personality rather than for the politics.
So it's just a very surface appeal?
I think probably most young people, if you ask them, like for example people in the queue at Fabric tonight, which policies of Ken Livingstone they were particularly attracted to, they probably won't be able to tell you. I think the voting has been very instinctive and quite knee-jerk in terms of they like what he represents. He seems to be speaking their language. I think for people who perhaps aren't really interested in politics on a day-to-day level, along comes a person who's a bit of a rebel that they can relate to, and people are going to vote for someone who kind of reflects their vision of themselves.
And presumably you don't remember him at all from 14 years ago in the GLC days?
Can't say I do.
So worries about Looney Ken spending money on
for a start, yeah.
mad projects. I mean, he put on some great pop concerts in those days.
Sure, I mean, there's a whole generation of people who really don't remember who he was back then.
I think it's the fact that he's the best of a bad bunch. I think that is the result of today. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks a lot. And from fashionable Smithfield back to fashionable Shepherd's Bush, Kirsty.
Ken Livingstone down by faint praise, and we'll be going back to hear from some other clubbers later on in the programme. Well, no sooner had Ken Livingstone slipped comfortably into the role of Mayor of London than he outlined an immediate task. Next week, he will be taking on the issue of the threat to the Ford plant at Dagenham, caused, he said, by the high pound, thus announcing that he intends a wide and clearly high-profile role. He's already said he's prepared to take the government to the courts if he believes their plans for the tube will be bad for Londoners. So will he, as he says he wants to, heal the wound with Labour, or does he represent clear and present danger for Tony Blair? Our political editor, Mark Mardell, reports.
I therefore declare that Kenneth Robert Livingstone is duly elected the first Mayor of London.
At this moment of triumph, Mr Livingstone looked a little tearful. He later quoted Churchill, "Be magnanimous in victory." He said he wanted to work with Downing Street.
People who stood for mayor because they love this city. And I want to try and draw a line in the sand between the divisions of this campaign and how we now go forward to govern this city. I want to try and create an administration which will be all-embracing, reach across parties, and try and achieve a position where the new GLA speaks with one voice on behalf of London's interests.
The Prime Minister, who a few short weeks ago said Mr Livingstone would be a disaster for London, said he hadn't changed his mind, but some conciliation slipped through gritted teeth.
Look, there's no point in me hiding from you my views about Ken Livingstone. I haven't changed those views. I believe them very strongly, but that's in the past, in the sense that the people of London have made their verdict clear, and it's my responsibility to make sure that it now works for London.
Despite the conciliatory noises coming from both sides, every bone in New Labour's body screams out that Ken Livingstone is going to seek trouble and conflict. As one source put it, Ken and government is like a dog in a lamppost. He just can't resist it. And the minister told me that they'd deal with Ken Livingstone in 3 ways. Publicly look for cooperation, but trying to constrain his action, and he said arm's length black propaganda. So at the moment, both sides are smiling at each other, but bracing themselves for a clash. So why is Labour so worried, and where could that collision come? What is the nightmare in Ken Livingstone's in-tray? First, of course, there is the tube. A centrepiece of Ken Livingstone's campaign has been challenging the government's plan for 3 contracts with private companies to improve the underground. Public-private partnership, in other words. Mr Livingstone wants investment financed by bond issues and said today that the government should respect the wishes of Londoners.
I'm hoping we can sort this out by looking at the figures once the government publishes its figures about the bids that have come in. Either those figures will make sense for London or they won't. I can't believe a government that's had this drubbing at the polls is going to want then to pick a fight with millions of Londoners who don't want their tube broken up.
The government will be very keen to get a deal. There is a deal to be made. The PPP will need some government support. It would be very uncomfortable, I think, for the government to impose it on Londoners without making that support. For the price of Ken Livingstone's corporation to get the thing negotiated by April next year, the government could offer long-term financial support for the underground and indeed some help with other schemes that Mr Livingstone will be very keen to get, like progress with Crossrail.
Policing is another hugely sensitive area, and one where the mayor has real powers. He'll appoint 12 members to the 23-strong Metropolitan Police Authority and set its budget. He's promised to show zero tolerance to crimes of violence committed on the grounds of race, religion, gender, age or sexual orientation.
The drug dealer, the racist thug, the mindless yobs who defiled the cenotaph, the monument dedicated to those who gave their lives for our liberty, will find this mayor distinctly uncuddly.
Out of the way, please! Mind yourself.
Today it only looked as if the police were nicking him in connection with jokes about rioting, but officers who remember the GLC will caution Mr Livingstone.
What I would urge is that both sides, all those involved in the police authority, realise that they have to work for Londoners. There is no point in conflict, and certainly a mayor who's in a conflictual situation with his assembly or has a lack of support in the assembly and in conflict with the Home Secretary and the government, it will be a lame duck mayor.
But perhaps the most telling area of potential conflict is over the threatened Ford plant at Dagenham. Mr Livingstone said today it's his urgent priority. He's meeting the Trade Secretary next week, and it sounds like he's weighing straight into macroeconomic policy, conventionally thought to be the province of the Chancellor and not one of the new areas of responsibility for the Mayor of London.
It's quite clear that the major problem for Dagenham, as for Longbridge, is that the pound is overvalued, and this makes it very difficult for our exporters to export successfully. And the totality is that we have lost 250,000 jobs in manufacturing in Britain since the government was elected, largely because of the overvaluation of the pound. And this is a clear point I will be making to Stephen Byers.
We're happy that any senior politician, including Mayor Livingston, are prepared to tackle the problems of Dagenham. We think that he needs to save jobs and not score points, and would be extremely concerned if he starts using the tabloids to score points against the government at a very delicate part of the negotiations.
Indeed, the government's biggest worry has always been that Mr Livingston will become the first port of call for TV, radio and newspapers looking for a quick quote, slamming the government, and that a bad relationship will get steadily worse.
Just behind you. I always look behind me in this game.
He'd be well advised to do so. New Labour would love a chance to trip him up. But friends of Ken say it's in the government's own best interests to seek conciliation, not conflict.
We're facing an election, probably in less than a year. Ken is overwhelmingly the most popular politician in London. If the government decides to have a war with Ken in the coming months, they will pay for it in lost seats at the general election. If they're sensible, they'll come to some reconciliation with Ken. If they don't, they'll pay an electoral price.
As well as the government, there'll be another group of politicians who'll be keeping an eye on the new mayor, the newly elected 25-strong Greater London Authority. Party politicians who the independent mayor can woo with his powers of patronage. They don't seem to buy consensus Ken.
You can't say that the Mayor of London is telling porkies, and I believe he really does want to work with us. The question is, what does he really want to do? You can love bomb everybody to death, but really the issues are, what policies are you going to pursue? What are your priorities? And the minute we can sit down and talk about that, I'm pretty sure that we can actually find ways of working together. That's what this assembly and this authority is about. But, at the moment, warm words are great, but I think we've got to go a bit further.
Oh, they always do this.
Wheelie bins and the very occasional bouquet may be the lot of many a local politician, but scarcely anyone recently elected to a senior job has earned so much suspicion before they've even lifted a finger. It'll be lonely and tough for an independent at the top.
Mark Mardell, well, I'll be talking to the main parties about Mayor Ken in a moment, but let's talk to one of his new friends, Darren Johnson. Now, Ken Livingston's uncharacteristically quiet following the election today. He's been giving lots of interviews beforehand, but you are, for tonight at least, his close friend, and I want to ask you a couple of questions, not only about your own performance, but about Ken. Have you spoken to him today?
He came in and had a friendly word with the new Green Group. We didn't discuss any deals or anything like that, but basically came in a spirit of cooperation. We had a few friendly words. We congratulated each other on our enormous election success, both him as an independent and the new Green Group on the Assembly and the vote we got.
What job are you looking for?
Well, lots of speculation about me as deputy mayor, but that's been frenzied media speculation. I've never discussed that with Ken. He's not discussed that with me. He has said throughout the campaign that he'd like to see me take up an environmental post in his cabinet. He's not discussed that with me since the election, but let's wait and see.
You've perhaps been stoking some of the fires of the deputy mayor conversations?
I've not been stoking fires. I've been asked numerous questions about this within hours of Ken first declaring himself as an independent. I was rung up by journalists asking if I would consider being his deputy should he be elected. And I have always said, as long as the conditions are right, to push forward the green agenda in London and to give us real opportunities to do that, then it's something that I'd be interested in, yes.
Tell me, do you think it's inevitable, just following on Mark Mardell's report, do you think it's inevitable that Ken Livingston will play a part on the national political stage?
I think it is inevitable. If you look at how disappointed people are in London with the performance of New Labour and that timid Middle England agenda, it's just something that Londoners are not keen on at all. They were looking to Ken Livingston as mayor, and they were looking to a radical Green Group in the Assembly, which was elected today.
So do you think we are in the midst of a new politics?
I think we're in for a very exciting time, and I say that as someone who actually stood against Ken Livingston in the mayoral contest, but he was my second preference. But I think we're in for a very exciting time in London, both in terms of a very radical agenda. Londoners have been crying out for some radical policies on the economy, on transport, on the environment, and also I believe people are very disillusioned with New Labour in London.
Well, we've got a member. If I can just stop you, there, Dan Johnson, because we have a senior member of New Labour here in the studio. Paul Boateng, first of all, the Prime Minister today said that he had not changed his opinion of Ken Livingstone one jot. His opinion of Ken Livingstone prior to this election was that he'd be disastrous for London. Is that your view?
Well, first of all, let's not forget it was New Labour and a New Labour government that created
That's in the past now. You've now got Ken Livingstone as your mayor.
Hold on, Kirsty. It was a New Labour government that created this new politics. We have devolved power, created a new Greater London Assembly, created the office of mayor, and our interest now is in making sure that that works. And we're going to work constructively with all those who have the best interests of London at heart. And it is for Ken to demonstrate how he is going to build on the trust that Londoners have put in him.
Well, in the spirit of reconciliation, what about his rejoining the Labour Party? Margaret Beckett seemed to rule that out today on the basis of the rules of the party disallow it.
Our concern aren't now with getting into constitutional issues about Ken and Ken's future. What we have to be concerned about are the key issues for London, and they are transport, they are business, they are law and order. And we look forward to working with all people of goodwill on the Assembly, the Mayor himself, in ensuring that we move forward on those issues. Because this is a modern, reforming Labour government that's about working in an inclusive and plural way. Ken will be part of that if he chooses to be part of that pragmatic, forward-looking, modernising path that we intend to take.
Does that include being a forerunner in the fight over Fords at Dagenham, making pronouncements about the state of the pound?
It includes making sure that we work with everybody, whether it's in the private sector, the public sector, local government. We work with everybody in order to build on the success that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair have made with the British economy. You know, let's talk about business investment. £100 billion worth of new business investment this past year. Now that's new Labour government working. And if Ken wants to contribute through the Greater London Assembly, through the Office of Mayor, to the success of London as a business centre, that's good.
Ian Duncan-Smith, coming to you, Steve Norris did very well. Did you do very well in part to do with the fact that he steered well clear of any issues over Section 28? He did not contribute to the debate over asylum seekers, the very things that William Hague has been highlighting in his campaign.
No, I think, first of all, let me say, I think Steve Norris's result is excellent, and I congratulate him for having run a very good campaign. As much as I congratulate, by the way, all of the members of the Assembly, and one forgets that actually we are in joint first place now in the seats on the Assembly, and the most important thing about that was that all of those members of the Assembly, including Steve Norris, stood on a manifesto which William Hague agreed to and signed off on. So there was no difference between what Steve Norris said, or the Assembly members, or for that matter, William Hague.
There was quite a radical difference because Steve Norris didn't talk at all about asylum seekers. He had a much more inclusive attitude, it would appear, than the Tory leadership.
But I think that says exactly what the Conservative Party is, which it is a broad church. People have a variety of views. And the most important thing about this new election, which Paul was going on about, we knew and realised, hold on a second, that the mayoral election was going to be about personality and about individuals. And we let the party pick somebody and go ahead and run their campaign and make it vary in certain ways, perhaps, but it's their decision, and we were happy to run with it.
But is that a fact of life now, then? If you're saying that you chose a person on the basis of personality as much as politics, then the fact, if we are going to have mayoral elections in this country and a number of big city mayors, that they will actually, as it were, skew politics in the early 21st century?
No, I don't think they skew politics. What this demonstrates is if you make an election about a single individual, then the parties concerned have to recognise that those individuals will dominate the agenda, and that's what we did, but the Labour Party couldn't come to that, which is why they got in the mess over Dobson and Livingstone and are now having to extricate themselves out of it.
Simon Hughes, when you hear this about the personality politics, and when you hear Paul determinedly saying, Ken must come to them, Ken must be conciliatory, I mean, does Tony Blair have a lasting headache?
We always knew, and I sat through our House of the Blessed Committee on the bill, we always knew that personality politics would be the name of the game if you have directly elected mayors. And that has some good points. It means that people are freer from the the hierarchy of their party. They're not constrained in the way the party might wish. They're bound, therefore, to be a challenge. Anybody would be bound to be a challenge. Steve Norris, had he been elected, Susan Kramer, would have not taken the same agenda necessarily as the party leader, because they have their own constituency. They have to deliver for their people.
But would you expect the new mayor to be talking in terms of taking the government to court for judicial review if they come up with a plan for the tube that does not meet what Ken Livingstone perceives Londoners' requirements are? I mean, that is fighting talk.
Well, it's fighting talk, but it was always inevitable. It was bound to happen. The powers of the mayor are actually very limited. Yeah. The government kept on reining in the mayor. I watched it happen. Behind the mayor's every power, there is a Secretary of State's power, but the reality is the influence will be great, the opportunity to take on government will be great. And if you're the mayor of the capital city of 5 million people, to be honest, you have a very big constituency and you can claim them on your side.
Do you think Ken can resist the temptation? He's already said that he wants the mayor of London to the same powers as the mayor of New York in 25 years. He's going to want to accrue more power.
You know, the people of London have chosen a mayor. The new Labour government has created the context in which that was possible. Ken voted for the Greater London Assembly and the mayor as the Parliament and as New Labour has determined it should be, with the balance of powers between the Assembly and the mayor, with the role for partnership with central government. And it is now for Ken Livingstone to make sure that that works. And this New Labour government will be working to make sure that London gets the very best that's on offer.
But it was also said by Tony, but there are lessons to be learned, not least though we don't want to revisit history at the moment, not least by the way this whole election was managed by Labour and the candidacy of Frank Dobbs.
Politics, Kirsty, is always about listening and learning. It's about democracy. It's about recognising that the electorate is saying something to you and learning from that process. New Labour will do that. New Labour has done that. That's why we're the successful party we are.
Well, we'll be coming back to you in a moment. But Ken had star billing last night, but that indeed was no surprise. However, the other political contests were much more dramatic. So safe was the Tory seat of Romsey that the late MP, Michael Colvin, maintained a majority. Liberal Democrat lomped home by more than 3,000 votes. Professor John Curtis, the BBC's election analyst, is here to explain what on earth is going on. Wait, what did go on?
Well, I think undoubtedly perhaps the most surprising thing that went on last night was the performance of the Democrats. After all, we'd had a year where Charles Kennedy had been leader and had been allegedly rather weak, and yet, as you said, they managed to win this Romsey seat. The first time they've won a seat from the Conservatives when the Conservatives have been in opposition for 35 years. And at the same time, they managed to hang on to more or less to their tally of council seats, despite the fact that the Conservative vote was rising. So I think undoubtedly it was that Liberal Democrat performance that must have been the most surprising thing about what was going on.
But William Hague claimed that people are coming back to the Conservatives.
He claims they're coming back to the Conservatives, but if you looked at Romsey, you might wonder what he's talking about. However, I think we need to remember a couple of things. Remember that the Conservative vote didn't go down very much in Romsey. It was basically the Labour vote going towards the Liberal Democrats that was the principal thing. And undoubtedly, I think Romsey was very much influenced by local factors about the candidates and by about local issues. Of course, William Hague can point to those 600 council seat gains virtually. But I think that's much more a reflection of how badly Labour did in these elections than how well did the Conservatives did. If you take the Conservative performance and turn it into an equivalent national vote, we're only looking at about 37% of the vote. And that's no better than Neil Kinnock was doing in the 1980s.
But Tony Blair isn't a shoo-in in the next election, though.
Now, I don't think Tony Blair is a shoo-in in the next election, and that's probably the most important lesson of these elections. It is true that we can anticipate that more people would vote Labour in a general election than did in these local and devolved elections. People vote differently for different elections. But what Labour have to bear in mind is that their vote is about 7 points down on what it was in local elections last year. So they're clearly down in terms of their share of the vote. And I think although Labour may say they'll do better in a general election, they would be kidding themselves if on the basis of this performance they were necessarily going to get much more than 40% of the vote in a general election.
John Curtis, thank you very much indeed. So what's the electorate going to make of what's going on? Here's Gordon Brewer.
Thanks, Kirsty. Well, we thought if political parties and multinational corporations can do it, why can't Newsnight? From now until the general election, we'll be running a series of focus groups where we'll be testing the performance of the parties. We don't claim the groups have any statistical significance. That's not the point. The point is to delve deeper than the simple questions asked in opinion polls and try to find out exactly what it is the voters like and dislike. Our panel was selected by a professional polling organisation, and we asked Deborah Mattinson from the company to ask the questions. Last night, while elsewhere people were voting, or more likely not voting, in the local elections, we ventured forth to find out how the voters of Middle England would vote in a general election. We chose Luton because it's exactly the sort of place New Labour needs to hang on to. Both the constituencies in the town voted Tory in 1992, but, admittedly with different boundaries, voted Labour in 1997. And Luton seems typical of the New Britain. Formerly a market town best known for its straw hat making, it now has a cross-section of managers and workers in the service sector, but with a large Vauxhall car plant, it still has a strong manufacturing base. At the last election, all of our panel switched to Labour from the Tories or Liberal Democrats. We started off by asking them how, after 3 years, they felt about New Labour.
The good thing that I think they brought in was the minimum working week.
Yeah.
But why does that not apply to doctors and nurses, which to me is the most important? You know, they're working extensive hours and sort of like they're in charge of us when we're ill, and they got to make these sort of decisions and they're expected to work goodness knows how many hours.
I think people have been disillusioned with the tax aspect, because I think with Labour it's felt like they've brought taxes in via the back door, which we haven't really been aware of, and then all of a sudden you think, well, I'm sure I normally would have more than that in my paycheck each month.
I think their policy on Europe is, I think it's failing, because while they're waiting and seeing, companies like Ford and Rover and Vauxhall are thinking about pulling out. So I don't think those companies can afford to wait and see, because they're losing too much, and I think all the exporters are losing on the strength of the pound. So I think they need to do something about that.
Continuing with the Millennium Dome, they could have built hospitals, pumped all the money into the NHS, could have built 3 new hospitals, called them the Royal Millennium Hospital, something like that.
You can say that when recently they've had sort of billions from somewhere else, which they've decided to pay off some of the government debts with. But why don't they pump some of that money back into the health service? Those debts would still have been there.
Next, we gave the panel a selection of words and pictures and asked them to choose a few which they thought summed up the government's performance. Interestingly, the perception of New Labour now seemed subtly different.
Active, because they certainly are. They are getting on and doing things. They might not be the things we want them to do all the time, but they're doing things.
Yeah.
Confident. They're certainly confident in what they're trying to do.
The other word I used, which I normally wouldn't use for describing a government, but caring. I think they have, as I said, they've been quite sincere.
Industry, family, and education.
Why did you pick the family?
Because for me, at the moment, I stay at home with 4 children. But I think those days are running out, because I feel that I'm being forced into going and finding a job, because my husband's wage isn't enough to support me and 4 children.
And what of William Hague and the Tories?
Reactive rather than proactive.
Ineffective. Because as an opposition, they haven't been constructive in any fashion.
The old story of the posh motors, that they still got the old image of being the well-to-do party and not really having the concern for the general average Joe public.
Everybody knew who Margaret Thatcher was. I think sometimes I have to think twice to think, who is the leader of the Conservatives? It doesn't, you know, it just doesn't spring to mind.
He just seems so old-fashioned, a bit of a droning voice, and I just don't think he's right as a leader.
We wanted to explore particular policy areas further, so we gave the panel cards scored from 1 to 10. What about the economy? No problems there then. But, worryingly for the government, the perception of its performance in meeting some of New Labour's key pledges was a lot more mixed. education, the National Health Service.
They've gone so far, but not far enough. They've still got a long way to go. They've made some improvements, but they've a long way to go, cutting waiting lists.
Working sort of like in a school, I do sometimes appreciate that there is so much pressure put on the teaching staff that it becomes an administration as opposed to what they're there to do, and it's very difficult for them. They rely too much, I think, on parents and other people, and that becomes a total reliance, and the more they rely the next year, and I don't think that's always a good thing.
3 weeks ago I had an emergency appendix operation. Had been on the Monday night doctor. Tuesday it was done. I was home on Wednesday. So really on the emergency side I have absolutely no cause to complain at all. They were absolutely marvellous up at Luton and Dunstable.
On crime, no one was much impressed at all.
I reported an incident at 5 o'clock one day, and I actually had a policeman call me back 3.5 hours later to ask me if the incident was still occurring, because they didn't have the resources to send somebody out and check it. I just don't think there's enough police out there. We need to see more police on the beat as a deterrent instead of riding around in their cars. I can't remember I see the last policeman on beat.
Youth crime, I think, is something that needs to be tackled. I never felt too unsafe before, but now as time goes on and you see younger ages in the paper with the reports that come out, I feel very unsafe and unsure, and I think it is something they seem to be letting slide, and it does need to be dealt with, and it seems to be forgotten.
But what of the party leaders themselves?
I think Tony Blair's personality when he first came to power, which people are slightly waning from, I think.
He has a very strong character, and I believe he's sincere, and I think sometimes that's why he has been criticised, because he is very sincere, and I think he's helped to deliver on devolution. I think that's been a really good thing.
He's done a good job with what he's got at his disposal, but his personality can't carry the government through.
And I think sort of being a family-orientated person, young children, that we perhaps associated more and perhaps thought we would have more faith because he'd perhaps be closely thinking on more to our way of thinking, because he was very much like what we think we are.
Hague is so... It seems to be disliked so much, but I think there's been such an emphasis put on spin and media presentation of the present government. I think it's actually nice to see somebody who has got, he's got his faults, and maybe people are picking up on the bad side, but it kind of does demonstrate how much media spin is being put on maybe issues that shouldn't be glossed over so much. So in a way, it's quite interesting to see the contrast between Hague and Blair, because you can kind of see through the spin.
How would you feel if you woke up in the morning and this was the headline in the newspaper, Labour triumphs again?
Most likely outcome.
We'll be jumping up and down anyway.
Another possible outcome, what would your reaction be if this were the headline, Tories snatch shock victory?
Definitely. Buy a new passport.
Is that what it takes to make him smile?
So, the moment of truth. Many of our panel are clearly not entirely happy with New Labour, so can the Tories reap the benefits? We asked how they would vote now in a general election.
Labour.
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, I suppose the same. Yeah, Labour.
It'd be Labour again.
Steve?
Yeah, I would vote for him again.
Labour.
Labour.
Same as, although things aren't moving as fast as we wished, I think they are heading in the right direction.
The second term may actually be better than their first.
Yeah, Labour.
The voters of Luton. Ian Duncan-Smith suggests you've got a lot of work to do in Luton, at least, if nowhere else. But the serious point there is that all these people were saying that they are disgruntled with New Labour over basic issues like health and education. They think the economy is rattling along fairly well, but they won't turn to Tories, and in fact they think William Hague is kind of boring and old-fashioned.
Well, I was interested when you brought that through, because I kept thinking that last night we had between 5 and 6 million in a focus group who promptly went and voted in a different manner. And I have to say to you, the trouble is sometimes when you get these focus groups all collected together...
You use them, of course.
Well, I have to say you lead rather than follow focus groups. And the reality is, in election after election, we're finding that people are rejecting Labour and are actually choosing Conservatives to vote for. And, just take the London election. I mean, the fact is that the media have written us off in terms of the Assembly, but we won in the first past the post. If there had been no PR, we'd have actually been holding the majority of the seats in the Assembly. We've got over, close on 600 gains in local elections last night. I know there's a long way to go. We accept it. There's a lot to do. But the reality is, I do believe the Conservatives have turned the corner, and we are now beginning to show to the electorate that there is an alternative.
So why did you crash so spectacularly in Romsey?
Well, I think there are particular features about Romsey. I make no bones about it. Romsey was not a good result for us, but at the same time, you have to ask yourself the question, what was at the root of it? And the biggest reason was the Labour Party collapsed completely in Romsey. And remember that in Romsey, which was a strong Conservative seat, you have 10,000 people who voted Labour at the last election. They are really core Labour supporters. They were never going to go to Conservative. They deserted the Labour Party and they wanted to protest against the government, so they went to Liberals.
But that's fine for Liberal Democrats, isn't it, Simon Hughes? A lot of tactical voting there means that Labour are hardly seen on the ground and you reap the benefit.
Well, no, every seat is different. I mean, Britain has lots of two-way fights. Luton is a Labour-Tory fight. Liberals have never registered much there. Romsey has always been a Liberal Democrat Tory fight, and there are places where there are Labour Liberal Democrat fight, and there are a few three-way places. So it was an odd choice, Luton, to choose on the night that the nation was looking at Romsey. The reality is that I think there is a difference. Local elections, people do increasingly vote on local issues. The one national election, the one election where the party leaders played, was Romsey. Tories had their worst election result last time, ever since 1830. They then lost hugely a seat that they even managed to hold then. And the reality is it's only twice in the last 100 years that an opposition party has lost a seat to another opposition. So the Tories, when they think, is William Hague winning the battle to win the hearts and minds, whether it's in Romsey or Luton, must be he isn't looking like, the Tory party aren't sounding like a party of government.
Your own leader, Charlie Kennedy, took pelters for his supposed invisibility around Romsey and indeed around these elections. Perhaps it does well for the party when he is, because look at what happens in Romsey.
No, he hadn't been invisible at all publicly. He'd been down there several times. He was very much involved. We got a surprise. I think John Curtis was reasonable and fair. We got 28% of the vote, the highest ever for 30 years in the local elections. We got a spectacular by-election result. And we hold the balance of power in London. Nobody can complain.
Do not hold the balance of power in London.
We do hold the balance.
No, you don't. It would require Conservatives to block it.
It's a slightly more conservative
requirement to block it.
Well, let me just bring in Paul Boateng in. Let's just bring Paul Boateng in. I mean, particularly when what John Curtis was saying about the lesson for Labour out of all this is that the next election, there's a lot to play for in the next election. And what these people were saying there is that they don't feel you're delivering on health, and they don't feel you're delivering in education.
Kirsty, what all of those people said was that they were going to vote Labour at the next general election.
Well, they say that now.
What we have got to do, and what we are doing, is not making the mistake the Conservatives made. We listen to people. And I listened to those people. I listened to those people, and the words they used were active, confident, caring, industry, concerned about education. And they're right about all those things. This is a government that's invested in modernising the health service, in modernising education. This is a government that's putting the emphasis on school standards, on improving healthcare. And of course these things take time. We've done a lot, Kirsty. We still have some way to go, and we are absolutely determined to keep the trust of those people, not only in Luton, but all over the country, because we are a party that's about hearts and minds everywhere, and that means delivery.
But hearts and minds is like motherhood and apple pie.
And that is precisely what we are delivering. Record levels.
Can I just say that these people were speaking last night.
Record levels of investment in education. Record levels of investment in health.
So why can't you convince them?
I've been to Luton recently, and what they know is that the health action zone there is beginning to deliver to people.
They didn't sound terribly enthusiastic.
What they know is that we are, in fact, investing more in policing and using the Crime and Disorder Act, antisocial behaviour orders, all those things, working now in Luton and Bedfordshire, and giving those people the confidence
Your
that
focus
this
group
is
is
a
not quite the
government
same as
that
their focus
will
group, Paul.
listen.
Well, let's
That's
just
enormously important. That's what we're doing.
Let's just reverse our way through to the turnout last night, which was pretty poor. Apathy or disgruntlement? I mean, which is it in terms of the electorate at the moment?
Well, they're not voting.
I'm just talking to Simon at the moment.
A combination of both. I mean, I think the truth of the matter, and the Luton group was actually quite representative in one sense. There's no great enthusiasm for the government. The government have lost, I mean, the
politics.
Well, for politics generally, I mean, the turnout is bad news, and let's all face up to that. But the reality is that the enthusiasm of the last general election, which was as much get the Tories out enthusiasm as it was get anybody else in, has not been converted into a great belief that the new dawn has arrived. And that's why more and more the local candidate, the personality, and the issue that matters to you matters. The pensioners.
It isn't a question about new dawn.
I'm afraid we just have to wait tomorrow for another new dawn. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much indeed. Coming up, we'll take a look at what tomorrow's papers have to say about it all with Boris Johnson of The Spectator and Steve Richards of The New Statesman. But first, a look at today's other news stories.
Good evening. As we reported earlier, Ken Livingstone is savouring his role as London's first elected mayor tonight after a hard-won victory. The man Tony Blair said would be a disaster for the capital took over 776,000 votes, guaranteeing him victory after the redistribution of second preferences. The Conservative Stephen Norris came a strong second, while Labour's Frank Dobson and the Liberal Democrats Susan Kramer filled third and fourth places respectively.
Ken Livingstone, 667,877.
The war's over, Labour's beaten, and the man most reviled by the political establishment is elected to run the capital. Ken Livingstone was still standing, despite everything his enemies could throw at him. Now, in victory, he had an emotional plea for reconciliation with his beaten rivals.
They stood because they love this city. I'm asking them now to put their talents to work for this city.
His promise of consensual politics won't be taken for granted. Not by the Lib Dem candidate Susan Kramer, who finished fourth, and not by the Tory candidate Steve Norris. His second place in the mayoral race was good news for his party. Ken Livingstone says he'll prove his critics wrong, that he'll serve the capital's interests, not his own. But it'll clearly take more than friendly gestures on election day to reassure the sceptics.
The mayoral election wasn't the only snub for Labour. In the English local authority elections, the party lost more than 550 councillors, while the Conservatives gained nearly 600. The Liberal Democrats are down by 18 seats, but managed to steal William Hague's thunder by winning the Romsey parliamentary by-election. The Hampshire seat had been one of the Tories' safest. Prosecution lawyers today read out the names of all 270 victims of the Lockerbie bombing to a hushed courtroom in the Netherlands. Earlier, the court heard that the Scottish police had initially suspected the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command of causing the disaster.
Today's witnesses were senior police officers. They arrived at Lockerbie within hours of the disaster and stayed for many months. The court was shown aerial photographs of Sherwood Crescent. As dawn broke, approaching officers first saw houses with their tiles missing, then the roofs themselves were gone, and finally they reached a huge crater where part of the plane had come to earth. Whole houses were completely destroyed. Gordon Ferry, a retired detective chief inspector, said police investigations initially focused on a Palestinian group. He told Bill Taylor QC for Megrahi that one of its members had been involved in other bombing incidents. Chief Inspector Alexander McLean searched for wreckage. He told Richard Keane QC for Fahima that American CIA and FBI agents were soon on the scene. Both accused have blamed others for the murders.
They're also probably going to insinuate that the FBI or the CIA have contaminated the investigation. Now, I infer this from the questions that the defense has been asking.
And then, for precisely 1 hour, a solemn requiem for the dead. The names and addresses of all 270 victims were spoken aloud.
The Prime Minister and his Irish counterpart, Bertie Ahern, have held a second day of talks with Northern Ireland's political parties at Hillsborough. Mr Blair said the mood had improved since his last visit. But the day was marred by a leaked memo in which a UK civil servant accused the Irish Foreign Minister of failing to understand unionist concerns. Hezbollah guerrillas in Lebanon have launched further rocket attacks on northern Israel in retaliation for last night's air raids. Israeli jets had attacked power stations in the Lebanese capital Beirut, cutting off supplies to much of the country. The raid was itself a response to an earlier Hezbollah attack which killed an Israeli soldier and injured 20 people. Software experts have warned internet users that the love bug virus has spawned several new variants. Meanwhile, investigators believe they've traced the email which began the chaos to a service provider in Manila.
The love bug may have infected computers from New York to London to Tokyo, but its creator lives somewhere here, in one of the world's least developed cities, Manila. However, poverty is no barrier to the growth of the internet. We went to the slum of Pasig, on the margins of existence, but also on the web, thanks to its own cyber cafe. The bug contained a message in bad English: "I hate to go school." So in theory, even these boys playing truant and surfing the web could be guilty. But the trail of guilt took us to this machine, the brain of the Philippines' largest service provider. It was from here that the virus spread around the globe. The company is now helping the FBI. It claims that it was the hacker's principal target, the work perhaps of a sacked employee with a grudge. And then a revelation. The love bug contained a second virus, even more devastating than the first, which was stopped just in time by this man.
It could have been so bad that I can't even imagine it and don't really care to.
Had that virus spread, the hacker could have had access to most of the world's computers, able to withdraw money from personal bank accounts or steal state secrets.
A sheriff's decision not to jail a motorist whose dangerous driving caused the deaths of 2 Hamilton teenagers has outraged the girls' relatives. 19-year-old Douglas Ramsey was driving at more than 50 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone when his van hit the 15- and 16-year-old last March. Today, the girls' relatives said his sentence, a year's probation, community service and a 5-year driving ban, sent the wrong message to young road users. Tomorrow marks the Scottish Parliament's first anniversary. After a year with more than its fair share of controversy, this is how First Minister Donald Dewar summed up the past 12 months.
Super parliamentary, but the press has been ferocious, and that's hyphenated.
And that's all for tonight. Gordon will be back here on Monday. Now it's back to Kirsty in London.
And now briefly back to Robin Denslow in Spitalfields. Robert, what have the voters been telling you outside the club?
Well, I've been carrying out a scientific study of the clubbers outside the club where Ken Livingstone supporter Fatboy Slim is appearing. Most of them, of course, are in fact Livingstone supporters. Reasons given: he's fun, we like him, and a lot of anti-Blair reasons. He's been kicked around by Blair, we don't like his authoritarian actions towards Ken. But surprisingly, 1 or 2 Dobson supporters, even here, who don't like Livingstone because of his support for direct action, which is blamed by them for the May Day riots. So even in clubland, there's a bit of Daily Mail still here. But mostly it's Ken's night, though he hasn't shown up to see his old friend Norman Scott, Fatboy Slim.
Thanks very much, Robin. Now you can go back to your dancing. We are joined now by Steve Richards and indeed by Boris Johnson for a quick romp through the papers. First of all, The Guardian, it's so good to be back, says Ken. I mean, Guardian fairly unequivocal. When it comes on to the Mirror, it's a different story, isn't it, Steve?
Is this
Red-eyed Ken? Well, his victory is enough to make a grown man weep. The thing about the Mirror is, this went against all their expectations.
It did. Well, all the papers just about got it wrong. Well, not their expectations.
Not
they all
expectations,
knew he was
what they
going to
wanted to
win,
happen.
but what they wanted to happen. And I think some of them now will readjust. This often happens after an election victory, when the other party gets in against the paper's wishes. They woo them for a bit. And I think some of the papers will start to be a bit nicer to him over the next few weeks and just test him out a bit to see what he's going to be like. They've lost touch with their readers on this issue, so they're going to have to get them back.
What do you make of it all, the way it was handled by the press?
Well, I think what's going to happen now, unfortunately, is there's going to be a terrific schmoozathon between not only the press and Livingstone, but between Blair and Livingstone. I think there's going to be a kind of Molotov-Ribbentrop pact between them, and Blair is going to you know, do what he does to everybody, which is reach out and suck him in.
Welcome him back into the party?
Well, I think probably eventually, but he's going to fold him into the big tent.
He'll have
And
to.
suck his juices
and
dry.
I think Ken Livingstone will be quite nice to Blair as well.
He will. It's going to be a nauseating spectacle for all those Tories who voted Livingstone in the deluded expectation that he was going to be independent. They're going to have to watch this guy fawning and grovelling like a spaniel.
Well, here we go with it. The Daily Mail says it's Blair who needs to pray, and the Daily Express saying got the message. But the Sun has another story. The Sun, I mean, Trevor Kavanagh's headline says that it looks like Tony Blair put the election back to October. On what basis do you think Trevor Kavanagh's got this?
It's quite interesting that, because Trevor Kavanagh on the inside pages, I think, has got it right when he assesses it as being quite a bad night for William Hague because of the Romsey by-election. I think, you know, if you had taken away the local election results and all the other things that were going on, if we had just had the Romsey by-election last night, a lot of the talk tonight would all be about the future of William Hague, and I think it was a very serious result for the Conservatives.
Moving on into David Aronovich and the Independent, what Labour must be worried about is the degree of cynicism and apathy. Surely not.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think there's a real risk now. I think David Aronovich has got it bang on. That lots of people will start to think, well, what is New Labour all about? People just don't think, what's the reason to turn out and vote for New Labour if you're an old Labour person? What have they delivered for you? And if you're a Tory, of course you're not going to vote for them anyway. What's the point of these people? What ultimately is Tony Blair really saying to the nation?
Was John Curtis right that there is a definite problem for New Labour? They certainly wouldn't necessarily make a majority.
Well, this is the second set of elections where they haven't got their vote out. They failed in the European elections. They failed again now. Now, the question is whether they can get them out in a general election. I think John Curtis was right to raise the question that it means that the result isn't a foregone certainty. But mind you, the Romsey by-election
it all depends on whether they can make people fear and loathe the Tories again. And if the Tories can be popular, then what's Labour saying? They've got nothing to say, these guys.
Thank you very much, both of you. Well, that's all from Newsnight tonight, but don't forget you can visit our website. I'll be back with more on Monday night. Until then, from all of us in the programme, have a great weekend. Goodbye.